Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Co-hosts today are Kelley Lane and Kyle Anzalone. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, and we will have some new platforms very soon. Our guest today is Angela McArdle, and this is a swapcast for the Around the Empire podcast and the Conflicts of Interest show. It's a broad discussion about war and foreign policy, interventionism, elections, and the handling of the pandemic with lockdowns and other restrictions, and its impact on the lives of Americans, the economy, and our rights. Angela McArdle currently serves as the chair for the Libertarian Party of the Los Angeles County, and she is seeking the National Libertarian Party Chair in 2022. Angela was a two-time candidate for California's 34th Congressional District. She's a paralegal and a legal aid who currently works in litigation focused mainly on real estate and constitutional law. She also has a private practice providing self-help legal services to low-income clients, and she was a key organizer of the 2013 protests in LA against a ban on feeding in public rights of way. Angela believes strongly in the sanctity of personal choice and allowing people to govern their own lives. We recorded this on March 16th, 2021. Welcome, everybody. Today we have a great discussion. Our guest is Angela McArdle who's speaking to us from California, Kelley Lane co-hosting, Kyle Anzalone co-hosting, and this is a swapcast between Around the Empire and Conflicts of Interest show. Welcome, Angela. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Sure.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for putting this together, Joanne.
All right, so we're going to talk about three topics tonight. One being war and foreign policy, surprise, surprise. What we're all about, and interventionism. We want to ask Angela how she feels about those topics and, maybe some ways forward she sees to improve the situation. We're going to talk about elections and election integrity and election reform, quote unquote reform in some cases, and also the handling of the pandemic and the lockdowns in particular, and the effects of those. And then we have a bonus question at the end, and that'll be the show. So to start off, Angela, if you would, just tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. I am the chair of the Libertarian Party of Los Angeles County. I'm very active in the liberty movement, not just within the official Libertarian Party, but as far as issue coalitions go, anti-war, anti-lockdown, Second Amendment rights, First Amendment rights, things of that nature. I'm also on the California Libertarian Party Executive Committee, and I am running to chair the National Party in 2022. So I spend a lot of time focused on liberty issues.
That's great. So Kyle, should we just roll into the war? Do you want to preface that in any way? War and foreign policy, just for a little background. Kelley and I tend to come from the more progressive side of things, though we're disgruntled, or maybe even ex-progressives, now independents. Kyle comes from the libertarian side of things. So it's kind of a good mix here. But Kyle, why don't you roll us into, talking about our thoughts about war and foreign policy, interventionism and such.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big thing with war and foreign policy is how important it is, of course, when you look at just the amount of spending, the budget. Maybe if you lump a bunch of entitlements together, that gets you, a bigger Social Security welfare lump sum. But military is huge, and it really doesn't get talked about, or if it does, it gets talked about in this obscure way we have now with Tucker Carlson, where should females who are 7 months pregnant be able to fly fighter pilots and wear pilot suit or is that, that like that's a conversation we end up having on foreign policy. So how do we have a real conversation on foreign policy and actually talk about the pregnant people we're bombing rather than who's flying our fighter pilots and what they identify as?
So maybe just roll into, your thoughts on war and foreign policy as an elected representative, how you would approach it. You're wearing two hats here, right? You'd like to be a person in Congress. You also want to run a party. And, just give us our thoughts on if you had, let's say you're the head of the Libertarian National Party. I would think you'd play a big role in setting the policy for the party, which I don't think would be a big surprise, but the party's been a little unpredictable lately. So, or, if you want to approach it from the aspect of as an elected representative, how you would do it. We'd love to hear about that.
Oh, sure. So you're right. The Libertarian Party at the national level has been a little bit all over the place for the past 4 to 6 years, I'd say, maybe even stretching further back than that, if you wanted to look at it since the mid 2000s. The leadership has not been really consistent. We haven't necessarily been principally oriented towards freedom. Instead, the National Party tends to sort of chase the approval of mainstream culture. And that does not leave the anti-war movement much room to breathe, really, in the national politics, because sadly, we've seen, no one seems to really care that much at the national level about the fact that we are still engaged in all of these wars of aggression across the country. So, I'm sorry, across the globe. It's really, really disheartening. I think the Libertarian Party could play a really great role in facilitating the anti-war movement and giving it some more dialogue at the national level. And one of the ways that I think that we should do that is probably by lending a stronger voice to veterans, because anti-war veterans are people who are here at home talking about their lived experiences. I think that liberals, progressives, second wave feminists got it right in the 1960s when they started championing the phrase, "the personal is the political." It seems like there's a connection that's very strong between personal experience and political and social grassroots movements. Ron Paul did an amazing thing when he got people to get really riled up about ending the Fed and being anti-war. And that was sort of still on the heels of the aftermath of all the September 11th attacks and the wars for empire. But here we are 20 years later, still dealing with it, and a lot of the enthusiasm is sort of gone. But what has taken its place are a lot of shattered lives from people who have come back just totally broken from military service. And I think that something that the Libertarian Party and some of the smaller third parties as well could really do to help would be to start lending a voice and, trying to push for them in media too. Alt media is really taking off. People are not paying so much attention to CNN and MSNBC anymore. At least people who are seeking the truth aren't. And so we should be there to really bridge that gap between veterans who are telling us how fruitless and damaging war is and people who are seeking the truth.
Yes, and the anti-war movement, I mean, as you said, Joanne, we all come from a little bit slightly different backgrounds. You and I'm more from the progressive side, but this is an issue that people across the board agree on. Ending wars and all of the spending, the defense budget is more than anything else. And so I think this is an issue that the mainstream media continues to ignore because they know that this is something that unites people across the country, that many people agree on, and it's something we can work together to topple the establishment narrative about it.
Yeah, Angela, that's a great point with promoting the voice of veterans. I know there's like Dan McKnight with bringourtroopshome.us that does pretty good work, and I think they would fall more on the libertarian side of things. So maybe that's, a group the Libertarian Party could work with. I think they've worked with the 10th Amendment Center, and I've talked with Mike Meharry about the Bring Our Troop, or not Bring, Defend Our Guard legislation that's about not deploying the National Guard to undeclared wars and stuff like that. And so, I think there is a lot of room for those voices and a need to promote them. I've had a veteran on the show who started in the Afghan war to talk about that. He's now an anti-war guy, Scott Spalding, and finding a way, especially within the libertarian platform, to up these voices. I mean, we all know, or at least all of us in the libertarian community know, that Ron Paul got the most donations from active duty military in 2012, more than all the other candidates combined. And so those voices are out there, and yet it seems rarely in the Libertarian Party do we end up elevating them. Think of a major libertarian that's and a veteran. It's Adam Kokesh.
Kokesh.
Yeah, Kokesh. That's right. I got there. Is one, but there's not a ton. So that's something we could focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam Kokesh is a veteran, so he's done a pretty good job at veteran outreach. I just feel like there are a group of people that just get left on the sidelines in all of the political dialogue, and it's really disheartening because they're the ones that have the most powerful stories. And I know we'll probably chat about lockdowns later, but one of the things that I've done in California in our Libertarian Party is go and interview business owners who have been just decimated by the lockdowns, small business owners. I think we could do the same thing with veterans to really bring their voices to the forefront and get some of that stuff going viral. I imagine if someone organized them, progressive, libertarian, or otherwise, into a strong voting bloc or a caucus within a party, you would start to see some things happen. Because even though the loudest, most progressive voices in the Democratic Party are still a minority, they still move the culture. They shift things, just like the people on the furthest right did in the Republican Party under the Trump administration. So it's just a battle for the Overton window. And if we can give the anti-war movement a voice, I think that it'll start to be heard a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues where common ground seems to be easy to find. Now, I don't know how well you get people to get along for whatever project you decide to go on. As you mentioned, a caucus, a movement, a coalition. I think it already happens informally. You can see right here, Kyle and I work together a lot. Kelley and I work together a lot. And it's mostly because of the common ground that we have found. And I am not one of those people who won't work with someone who's outside of my political party or ideology. Certainly not anymore. Maybe there was a time. But as Kelley mentioned, across the board, and I think this really scares the establishment, the support for wars are very much dwindling. And you really have to wonder, why the establishment is so fearful right now, particularly of the military. You have to wonder why Trump got such support from the military. The Libertarian candidate in 2016, Gary, his name's already...
Gary Johnson.
I remember reading polls of something like military.com or the Military Times or something, where they estimated that he got a lot of votes out of the military. And wasn't he taking an anti-interventionist stance to some extent?
Yes, definitely.
So, yeah. And now we have this president who immediately puts a halt to any idea of withdrawals that were already underway, talks that were underway, and various throughout. I mean, the guy, there's hard to find much good about that guy, but it does look like he was going to pull some troops out, right? Which would be different. And you're clearly not allowed to do that. The pushback on that was just astounding.
Right. We saw Donald Trump, present this fairly strong anti-war position for someone coming out of the Republican Party. And then we saw quite an about face on it as his administration got filled full of people, that we all probably refer to as the swamp. And it seemed like there wasn't a really consistent perspective on that. It seemed like there was a lot of bickering and infighting and shuffling people around. I feel personally that the powers that be did everything they could to keep wars going, even though they had a president who was inclined to get rid of them. And who knows what all happens and what kind of political pressure that you're under once you get into the White House. I try to, I take everything with a grain of salt, I guess. Like I'm not in the White House, and I don't know what people are whispering in president's ears or what kind of threats or veiled threats they're making or what kind of gross compromises they have to come to. But I think that the incentives to keep our country in perpetual warfare are really strong. And that's something else that we should take into consideration when we're pushing back against the warfare state is just how deep the tentacles go. They're really deep.
Well, regarding the anti-war movement, on the left, I hate to use left-right terms anymore, but on the Democrat side, I've been working on a project with Assange Countdown to Freedom. It's with Cornell West, and there's this piece of one of his speeches that we put in, and it is so powerful because he starts talking about, whether it's a life in Libya or a life in, he's listing off everywhere around the globe that we're dropping bombs and killing Black and brown people, as he said. And the crowd, you can hear, and this is a Bernie 2020 crowd, and they are cheering even louder for those sections. So I think that there's just largely a bit of, I guess, denial, or just people don't know. A lot of people that consume mainstream media, MSNBC, they just aren't aware. They think, we're spreading democracy. But as the truth starts to come out through, podcasts like Joanne and Kyle that cover, foreign policy, people have to start, they do start opening their eyes to what's really going on. And I think once they really know the truth, they are against it. They're just kind of still in the dark. So I think it's great, and having the veterans come on and talk is extremely powerful. That really gets the message across. But I think they're right to join that movement. They just haven't yet.
Yes. They are pre-anti-war movement. That's what I'd call them.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
Angela, I'm sorry, Kyle, please go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna mention that, Angela talked about how deep the tentacles are and how hard it is to end the wars. We just found out in the past day now that they actually have 1,000 more troops in Afghanistan than they advertised. It's actually 3,500 and not 2,500. They weren't counting the special forces troops. And who knows that this is another example like Syria, where the officials will later come out and straight up admit that they were lying to Donald Trump and hiding the numbers from him like they were doing in Syria, or if this was a case where Trump knew it and was trying to deceive the numbers to continue to fight the Taliban more. I guess that's unclear at this point, but it's so hard. And as Kelley was saying, trying to wake people up to this, because I think 3/4 of veterans and 2/3 of the overall American people support ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet we can't get the politicians to move on this. I think part of it is they always come up with an excuse, why it's not the right time to leave. And so whether it's Tammy Duckworth saying, I want to bring the troops home, I just don't want to bring them home in body bags, or the Republicans saying that, well, look what happened in 2011. We left Iraq, and then 3 years later we had to go back to defeat ISIS. That'll always end up being kind of the spin that keeps us in these wars. So it's so hard to fight against. But go ahead, Joanne.
So I was just wondering, what year was it 2008 that Ron Paul ran?
Yes.
And when he got some real traction, and I the story that I hear from people I find credible is it was just taken away. It was rigged away from him.
Yeah.
And
I believe that.
Yeah. And I can remember seeing, bridge overpasses, big, either things painted or signs, Ron Paul Revolution. And I was like, who is that guy? What? I don't even know what that's about. That was the beginning, though, of a coalition. And I think there bits of some of the same things have reappeared and kept popping up ever since then. Your ideas, your vision for the Libertarian Party. I'm not sure if you will approach it as your personal vision or whether just I'm a good leader, I'm going to get all of us together and we're going to together come create a platform and a combined vision. But what happened to that Ron Paul energy in the
Sure.
political forum? And is that a direction that you would want to go?
Absolutely. I mean, I want to see the Ron Paul Revolution 2.0 kick off within the Libertarian Party this time instead of the GOP. I feel that the Trump's populist movement sort of sucked all of the air out of the room in the GOP and has made it too difficult for a liberty revolution to take place within that party. So I would like to make the Libertarian Party a more welcoming place for principled libertarians instead of just an internal party social club. And I would like to see the Ron Paul Revolution, sort of spread its wings again. That's really my vision for the LP, is to make it a place for true libertarian activism again. And as far as like what happened to it, well, some of the energy was funneled into Young Americans for Liberty and some of the other offshoot organizations. There was a really strong youth movement. So that sort of continued on, but it didn't necessarily stay as principled. So some of the candidates that Young Americans for Liberty supports are very principled, but some of them are not so much. You get, in my opinion, what are just kind of typical GOP candidates. It's a real grab bag of principles within that organization. And, eventually Ron Paul, he was no longer in office. And so his group kind of became, leaderless. And so they're sort of out there, but they're not necessarily oriented towards a particular action. And I'd really like to fix that. I think that everything that he spoke about with the remnant is really, it's very poignant and it's very timely. So Ron Paul tells the story of the remnant that he pulled from a short story called Isaiah's Job. It's from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. And it's that, God goes to the prophet Isaiah and says, okay, I want you to go out and I want you to preach to the people around you and tell them how bad they've got it and how everything is just going to hell and things are a disaster. And if they don't turn back now, they're just doomed forever. And Isaiah says, well, okay, and then God reminds him, and by the way, they're not going to listen to you and it's going to be terrible and they're going to ridicule you and hate you and threaten you. And then Isaiah says, well, that sounds like a pretty bad time. Why would I do that? That sounds totally pointless. And God says, well, you don't understand. You're preaching to them, but you're not really preaching for them. Your job is to go out and preach this message so that the people around you who do care, who are still principled, the remnant, so that they hear you and take heart and are encouraged. Your job is to build them up so that when everything else just burns down and civilization collapses, you guys can rebuild. And I want that to be what the Libertarian Party and the Liberty Movement at large does for the country. Like whatever we're dealing with, lockdowns, devastating wars abroad, fiscal policy that's just, basically debt enslavement to our children. I think that we need to really develop and cultivate a core group of us who care very much about the future. And I want it to be the Libertarian Party, but I want it to be bigger than that, because the whole point of the LP is to make the world a freer place. It's not just to make us freer in our own lifetimes. It's to make the world a freer place for everyone. So that's my vision for the LP, and it's how I'd also like to rein in what's left of the Ron Paul Revolution.
Interesting.
The parallels there with just listening to you talk about all that, the parallels with the Bernie Sanders movement and the Democratic Party are kind of shocking. I mean, really, if you could get those groups together, even though we know there are issues, I'd love to ask you a little bit about healthcare, because I think that's one of the big ones where progressives, we'll say Dem exiters, former Bernie people, don't agree, with libertarians on. But if you could take those two groups, I mean, that's the majority of the country right there, and could really get
Yeah.
something done. And I find a lot of those people that don't think in the two-party terms, they also are a lot more open-minded about working with other people, like you said, Joanne, that don't think exactly like you do, or don't have everything the same, that they're not afraid to work with others. But we have to acknowledge that there are those issues where we don't see eye to eye, like healthcare. So I'd love if you want to elaborate on that at all. I don't want to steer too far off from foreign policy here, Joanne and Kyle, but I would love to know where can we find that common ground between X or whatever progressives and libertarians when it comes to certain things like healthcare.
I think we should work on single issue coalitions very much. And I think that if libertarians and progressives want to work on healthcare reform, one of the ways they can do it is to actively seek out regulatory capture that they both don't agree with and change it. So if insurance companies are getting special kickbacks, if they are incentivized to cheat people or be dishonest, we can hone in on those things and try to change them. And that may be a small section, but it might be a very, very powerful section of laws and regulations as well. And like that's how I think you can form coalitions on anything. Is you might think, okay, it's too broad of a divide, we'll never get there. But if you just dig deep enough, you can usually find something, even if it's fairly narrow in scope. And the more narrow in scope something is, usually the easier it is to work on. So that's one thing I'd recommend. Libertarians do not like corporatism. We don't like special interest cronyism. And I'm sure that Bernie supporters and progressives would agree on that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So kind of going in a more narrow focus makes sense, because I think the discussion tends to be just, oh, we're for Medicare for all and libertarians are not. And people don't talk past that. So that great information there. Keep that in mind.
Yeah, and you can use a broader concept to keep to glue it together too. Something like anti-corruption, something like people should have access to healthcare. I mean, there are certain things we certainly would agree on, how to get there, the solutions. That's where we start to crack up. But I think we can all see the direction that things are going in and agree that this isn't the way we want things to go. Looking at the time, does this seem like please bring up anything else on the war and foreign policy topic too, but it seems like a good time to sort of roll into elections, since we brought up we're on the Bernie and the Ron Paul subject a little bit. And everybody want to move to the next topic? Yeah. Okay. So this time we want to talk about, we can frame it within the 2020 election. We could talk about that. The issue of election integrity. I think that to differing degrees, or maybe for different reasons, I think we all have some serious issues with what we saw going on in the 2020 election, and in what we were not allowed to see, though what we were denied by courts and other officials and things like that. And even more disconcerting, and the reason why today is a good time to talk about it, is that the House passed their very first bill is something called HR 1. And it has another Orwellian name. What is it called again? Oh gosh, now I'm going to forget that Orwellian name. I know I've got it here in the People's Act. Yeah, the People's Act. And they call it a democracy reform. It's an 800-page bill. And it has some big changes into it that seem to centralize at least the regulation of elections. The running of elections, I guess, is still done locally, but there's a lot of uproar about it. But it has passed the House, and now the Senate is going to take it up in a hearing, I believe, next week. And it just makes me uncomfortable that in such a short period of time, when the people who were just elected in an election that had seems to have had some really big problems, are going to roll right in and change all the rules for elections. That just seems like, everyone's greatest fear and things historians talk about, like, of course, if you're going to sort of cheat in some way or manipulate in some way and get yourself in power and then change the rules. Okay. We gotta talk about this. Anybody else?
Yeah.
I didn't explain that very well. Maybe you guys want to chip in on that.
Well, it's an 800-page bill. I don't know how well any of us could possibly explain it in a short period of time.
Yeah.
I've looked into it. The first thing that I find disconcerting is when I try to Google it or, look it up on a major search engine, I'd only get opinion pieces. I don't get even excerpts of the bill. So that disturbs me. I'm like, what are they trying to hide? Why do they not want me to know what it is? And it's like half of the articles are talking about how there was no election fraud. Okay, well, what does that have to do with the bill? So that disturbed me to no end. And it just seems like another centralization of power. It just seems like a power grab to me. I'm very active in local politics, I guess, maybe state level politics. So what I mean by that is I've run for Congress twice. So I've spent a good chunk of time down at the local, it's called the Registrar Recorder's Office in California, filling out election forms and turning them in and getting signatures. And I'm pretty familiar with how it works. And I've helped at least half a dozen other candidates through the process, hand holding. California has some really particular, tight, I guess, straight-laced laws on how to do things, but they're unique to California, right? I don't know that it's a good idea that we should make all 50 states have the same election rules. California's rules are sort of tailored to California. Do I think they're sort of cronyist and, onerous and difficult? I do. But I don't think that that's the case in every state. And people have different demographics. There are some counties that are more electronically savvy than others. There are places that insist on doing things by hand. There are places that have tried to implement electronic voting and it has been absolutely just like cast out. And people have said, we don't want that here. And they would rather deal with paper ballots. And I really do think that we need to leave that up to the individuals. If people are concerned about election fraud, they should be the ones who are able to decide how their elections are run, I would think.
Definitely, from my point of view, for sure.
I think we need a strong candidate coalition. I say independent candidate coalition, whether you're a Green, a Dem, a Libertarian, whatever, but an independent coalition fighting for election integrity. And I think that includes changing these machines, or insisting on machines that aren't a black box, as they say in that community, the activist community. But what you said about the there was no election fraud, I witnessed it myself in election security groups that are largely any blue will do, is what I call them, of basically saying, shh, like, don't say anything now, like all that stuff where there's like funny business with the elections. No, it's fine right now, because they wanted Trump out. And it was very alarming to me, because I think if we don't have free and fair elections, I mean, obviously we don't have democracy. I'm of the opinion, if it's even the person I don't want to win, I want it to be real. So I think that we need candidates to get behind something that is more transparent, and not and yes, I think having a nationalized election system is kind of a scary prospect, again, if it's not transparent. So leaving it up to the states is probably a safer bet at this point. But we could have a uniform system as long as it was like built to specs of a guy, John Papa, that you've spoken with before, Joanne, on your chat with Around the Empire. He works in IT security, and he's built a system that is basically unhackable, if you will. It's transparent at each step. And I think you're right. The subject is so huge that people just, you got to read this like 100-page bill or whatever. It's confusing, and we need to simplify it for the public, but have candidates get behind something, on the same message about it, I think would be very helpful.
There
Yeah.
are African countries that have started doing blockchain voting to
Mhm.
try to make them election tamper-proof. I think Zimbabwe might have. It's really surprising where some of these technologies come from. You're like, Zimbabwe elections? That seems like wouldn't they be like more corrupt than the United States? But after the last 2 election cycles, I'm not putting us up at the top of
No.
elections that have a lot of integrity in them. I sadly, I don't think so.
No.
So one thing I've picked up on in the past couple of weeks is not only at the national level but the state level, it seems like there's a lot of action going on with voter laws. Republicans trying to make it at times just seemingly more difficult to vote, like trying to make early voting on weekends in particular impossible, or Democrats trying to make it so that like any paper that shows up at the voting center is going to be counted. And I was thinking, and I heard Crystal and Sagar on the morning listening team, and they always have interesting things to say. I don't know if I agree, but they said that the next few years there would be like a real kind of battle going on to change the voter laws. And I was thinking that's probably going to really hurt the third parties. I don't know if it'll be intentional within the laws or not, but just I know the Libertarian Party spends an awful lot of money just trying to keep its on the ballot in all the states, and that's a pretty expensive task. And so I'm guessing that'll make it harder. It'll probably be more difficult for the Green Party that's a little bit smaller and isn't on the ballot in all these states. And I'm sure for local local levels, if you're not a Republican or a Democrat and you don't have access to like their connections to the system, suddenly things are going to get a lot harder to run for office. And so I think that's should be a real concern for all of us.
That's a good point. Yeah, ballot access is a real pain. It's really ridiculous, and some states make it harder and harder. Indiana tried to pass some nonsense bill to keep third parties out by dramatically increasing the signature requirements to get on the ballot. It failed. They got really freaked out because the rainwater campaign for governor did pretty well. And Iowa is now passing a bill to increase, I think, the signatures that you need to run at a state level or gubernatorial level to like 5,000 plus. It's ridiculous amount of work to knock people's doors, especially now that people are gripped in fear from, the coronavirus pandemic. Another thing that this could potentially impact that I didn't think about until now is there are certain states and areas that have adopted ranked choice voting and different voting styles in order to, try to sort some of this mess out and make people feel a little bit more satisfied. So I can't imagine how the federal law is going to, I mean, maybe there's a workaround, but I could see it making that difficult, or also making it harder to, change the way that you vote in the future. Ranked choice voting, star voting, there are a couple of other formats, and obviously I'm in favor of anything that's going to help people feel a little bit better, about their conscience when they cast their ballot.
I did come across a statement from, I guess it's an article from the Green Party on their website about HR1. And what they're saying is that there are several poison pills for democracy and for opposition parties like the Green Party in this bill. They're saying, I'll just read a couple of bullet points I got here. HR 1 quintuples the amount of money Green presidential campaigns, and that would mean all third party campaigns, will be required to raise to qualify for federal matching funds from $5,000 in each of 20 states to $25,000 per state. Then they say it undermines everyone's right to organize electorally against the parties of war and Wall Street. In a recent Gallup poll, a record 62% of US voters said that we need a new major party. So they're just sort of talking about the importance of third parties. Then they say it abolishes the general election campaign block grants that parties can access by winning at least 5% of the vote in the previous presidential election. And HR 1 would eliminate this provision that was created to give a fair shot to alternative parties that demonstrate significant public support. And then they say that it replaces the general election block grants where each qualified candidate receives a set lump sum of public funding for campaign expenses. They replace it with matching funds through election day, a huge step backwards for public campaign finance reform, using the above mentioned criteria designed to squeeze out alternative parties and independent candidates. And there's 2 more bullet points. And then it says eliminate the limits on donations and expenditures candidates can receive and make. So that's another thing that apparently is in this bill, which I haven't read the 800 pages myself. And then one last thing, it says it inflates the amount of money that national committees can give to candidates from 5,000 to 100 million. That's quite a jump. An astonishing increase of how many, there's no commas here. It looks to me to be about 2 million%. That would give party bosses virtually unlimited power to flood elections with big money. So that's just some of the things they picked out. The Democrats frame it as sort of the most important democracy reform to protect our elections since the Civil Rights Act. They compare it to the Civil Rights Voting Act. And there's an article on Mother Jones, which is a completely co-opted media outlet right now, by the way. They say that it expands automatic registration and 2-week early voting across all 50 states. It beefs up mail-in voting, which is one of the things that was most problematic. Well known across the world. It has high potential for fraud. And they say Mother Jones resident voting rights expert Ari Berman says, quote, it's really the most significant democracy reform bill since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And then they talk about HR 1, the People's Act, and they also talk about another John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They would actually have both of those things, what they say, to safeguard voting rights. And then coming from the more right-wing outlets, you hear things like that the Democrats feel an urgency to do this because Republican majorities in state legislatures are passing legislation bills in swing states that are aimed at tightening election laws based on the things they saw happening in the 2020 election. The ACLU said that it would set up an automatic voter registration in states that do not currently allow it. Then it would also prevent a state from significantly limiting early voting. I think it makes it more difficult to clean up voter rolls, which, sometimes that's done for legit reasons. Every day that thing becomes, more out of date because things change. But I think it's also been abused. At least we suspect it has. But anyway, they're messing with that. And it says that it sets national standards for elections, that by requiring states to have election day voter registration, so on the spot registration as well, early voting days for 15 days, limits the money in politics and ends partisan gerrymandering. Good luck with that. And establishes new ethics rules too. So there's a Fox News article where they're saying it's an 800-page monstrosity, that it would usurp the role of the states, the most dangerous and irresponsible election bill this person has ever seen, in an opinion piece. It'll interfere with the ability of states and their citizens to determine the qualifications and eligibility of voters and to be able to ensure the accuracy and validity of the voter registration rolls. That it eliminates basic safety protocols, mandates new reckless rules and procedures. It eviscerates state voter ID laws that require a voter to authenticate his identity. And it makes it harder to manage the voter registration rolls. What else is in here? Onerous new regulatory restrictions on political speech and activity, including online and policy-related speech by candidates, citizens, civic rights groups, unions, corporations, and nonprofit organizations. which I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
Joanne, I wanted to mention, if anyone listening is more interested, this because election stuff gets kind of very dry and boring. Lulu Freistat and Benny Smith have been doing live streams on Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. It's under Smart Elections. And they were both very active in and instrumental in Tim Canova's campaign and what all happened in 2016. And then 2018 also in his race. But I found that they've been some of the few that really strive to be nonpartisan, even though I know that they both lean progressive. Lulu's a journalist, sticks to the facts. Benny is just very, he's an IT guy, and he's also on a board of elections in, I think it's Memphis, Tennessee. But they had Howie Hawkins on recently to talk about how HR1 was affecting Green parties, and I haven't had a chance to listen to the whole thing yet, but I think they really do try to do a good job of looking, and they had a Republican election attorney on too, which I was shocked because normally that activist group does not talk to Republicans. So I thought that was good of them to do that. I mean, if we're going to tackle this, it isn't a partisan issue. So,
So I guess, like, Angela, and you, from your perspective, it looks like, assuming that the Green Party's take on it, it looks like it's, and this doesn't surprise me, going to make it much more difficult for third parties to ever rise, other than being this symbolic thing that you can cast a few ballots. You can cast your ballot for if you're really pissed off at but it just props up the two-party duopoly at a time when, well, I mean, we always need other options, third parties and such, but at a time when I think we particularly need it. So this is probably not news to you. You've probably seen this kind of thing before, but I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on that as well.
I think it's really disgusting that they would compare this election, quote unquote, reform to the Civil Rights Act. It really grosses me out that they think that what they're doing right now is akin to giving, Black people voting rights. That really makes me gag. I think it's interesting how they want to raise the bar for us to participate as third parties, make it more difficult. And then at the same time, they give themselves like even more money to dump into election funds. But we get pushed out of that. We don't get that opportunity, which that is also, really vile behavior. Libertarians are, like, we want as few laws as possible. We would like ideally as few election laws as possible when it comes to like financing. But the way that they've tooled this, like, you can't support when they're like, yeah, we'll take all of the money except you don't get to play. So I imagine that you'll probably hear people, trying to compare this, people on the right, compare it to Citizens United or something. Or maybe the left will say, you got Citizens United, why can't we get this? It's just sort of like the pendulum swinging back and forth of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
People are just they're not thinking critically about this kind of stuff. I hope that it doesn't pass. I would encourage people, obviously, to write your senators and lean on, do a little bit of research and see if there are lobbying groups who would be willing to fight against this, and try to be inventive about who you reach out to speak to your senators on your behalf, because it's not good. I'm hoping that Republicans will strike it down. I guess we'll see. The House is pretty split.
Yeah,
Senate,
most people seem to be saying that they don't think that it's going to make it through the Senate intact, because they won't be able to get 10 votes for the cloture vote to pass the cloture. Then they say, well, they're going to blow up the filibuster, and this is a perennial thing. We hear this a lot of times. But I guess it's, to me, not to you personally, but I'm really disappointed in the libertarian movement, for example, on this election. on these proposed reforms, on the Great Reset kind of thing and the pandemic and lockdowns. Like, I thought they would be some of the biggest, strongest voices on these issues. It goes to the core of what you guys are about, seems to me. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I would have hoped that you, I hate to say you, because it's not you personally, but
The group.
this movement would have been the ones that we would hope to rely on in moments like this. Not that we don't all have responsibility to do those kinds of things, but like, what happened? I'm confused.
Well, what happened was you have a group of people who are the classic bad trope of fiscally conservative, socially liberal, who have taken over the Libertarian Party, and they're not very principled. So what you see them doing instead of putting liberty at the forefront is chasing after the culture. And right now the culture is sort of like wokeism, social justice warrioring, being offended easily, and being afraid to speak out. And that's not a good place to be. So instead of being oriented towards liberty, the Libertarian Party has a little bit of a self-esteem issue. And so it's afraid to sort of speak out and put liberty at the forefront. Instead, we go around saying things like, oh, we want the same thing, we just want to achieve it differently. But as we could see over the last year, some of us do not want the same things. I want to be free. I don't want to be locked in my home. And that's something that the Libertarian Party should be putting at the forefront of its messaging. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I think about liberty, one of the first things I think about is whether or not I'm imprisoned. And most of us have been put on house arrest for a year, the better part of a year, especially if you're in a very blue state like I am in California. So, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. The Libertarian Party itself has not done well on this at all. It's been an embarrassment, which is why I'm running for national chair. Now, I will give credit to some of the libertarian talking heads and people who are the movers and shakers in the party, but not official party members. So the Ron Paul Institute has done a great job. The Mises Institute, Tom Woods, Dave Smith, Michael Malice, who's more of an anarchist. Those people have spoken out really strongly against lockdowns and all of the other status quo garbage that has been thrown at us. So I would like to see the Libertarian Party do the same thing and actually be oriented towards freedom, not pandering and begging for people to like us on social media. Because when you abandon your principles and beg people to like you, what ends up happening is that no one likes you.
Very well said. Wow.
Great point. I was just a year ago. I mean, I remember the internet was plastered with articles. There are no libertarians in a pandemic. And I feel like the Libertarian National Party kind of read that and said, okay, we're going to say, oh, well, it's voluntarily okay. So it's all private business that's doing this. So if, you go into a private business, then they get to say whether you wear a mask and have to social distance and everything. So they I think really got bullied into this shut up, there are no libertarians during the pandemic, you people are supposed to be quiet right now, this is the time where big government needs to save everyone. And I mean a year later, I think everybody should has a good idea of why they should be a libertarian, why the government shouldn't have the power to lock people in their homes in the first place, because they're going to abuse the hell out of it and they're going to make it last as absolutely long as possible. I mean, now it's to the point where when a state starts to open up and reduce some of the COVID regulations, they actively root for that state to turn into, a catastrophe and a crisis. They should be like, oh, wow, if Florida could open up, maybe that means our state could open up. If Florida opens up, it's, oh, that state's going to turn into hell. And even when it doesn't, they don't say, oh, maybe we could reconsider our policies now. It's, oh, they just got lucky, or this other factor and this factor and that factor, and they just downplayed. And it seems like they're really going to try to get these lockdowns to go on. I don't know how long.
I'm really curious if there are any amongst the louder, more vocal libertarian voices out there against the lockdown. do they focus much on the fact that the IFR, the infection fatality rate, is really low? That's something I've brought up before. I've posted it on Facebook, and I'm not a. I mean, I believe the virus is real. I understand how many people have died, but when you start digging in and looking at the by age group, it's something they never report on. Is that, oh, there are this many deaths, and boy, do you have to spend hours digging to try to find out, well, I mean, are these 12-year-olds? I mean, how serious is this really? And I'm not to say elderly people don't matter, but are all these deaths in the nursing home? And it's just one aspect of this whole thing that I found would have helped calm some of the panic. Not that we didn't need to protect people that were vulnerable, but just that the infection fatality rate is very low. Maybe not some of the more recent strains. The UK version, I guess, is worse. But anyway, do you guys know?
Oh, yeah. Tom Woods covered that really well in several podcast episodes. He's got resources on his website. I think it's tomwoods.com.
Okay.
And he's interviewed some heretical epidemiologists like Professor Martin Koldorf, who and he's a progressive. He's from the left, but he's just not crazy. He's got integrity. And he said, absolutely, like this makes no sense. This is absolute nonsense. The mainstream media are being dishonest about all of the statistics. So yeah, I definitely recommend that you would check out Tom Wood's website for anything related to any statistical stuff related to the pandemic. Is really fantastic.
I will.
The Mises Institute too.
Okay, but as you said, the wokeism, it's amazing how powerful that is to shut down any discussion. Like I just said, I feel like I have to preface it with like, I believe it's a real virus. I'm not like, I'm not in disbelief of that, but I'm just asking questions about the real, like, danger here. And but in certain circles, you even bring it up, you're shut down immediately. So yeah, I'm glad to hear there are more voices. I don't hear a lot of it. There's just a lot of misinformation out there too, so it's hard to weed through.
I would also think that the World Economic Forum's infamous video, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. All these unelected people with this vague plan that saying like no one's going to own anything anymore. Like, I expect you guys, that was Klaus Schwab. Yeah. I expect the Libertarian Party to go after that one like gangbusters.
Yeah.
So they're not going to own anything either. The
Right.
top, right. Okay.
Right. Oh, well, if I'm elected chair of the National Party next year, I will be going after that hardcore. Young people don't quite understand, and it's partly because we've been burdened with inflation, that they don't understand what an egregious violation it is to say that you're going to own nothing, because they think, well, I don't own anything now. I just, I need help. I'm in this situation. I'm in that situation. I can't imagine it. But you don't want to be in a position where you're retiring and you haven't been able to accumulate anything to take care of yourself. That's not a position we want anyone to be in. When people are retiring, they should be able to have a modest, a small piece of property. I don't think that that's controversial for any political organization, to say that I should be able to own my own home, have a retirement account. And it is extremely disturbing to think that, like the world's elites, the wealthiest people in the world don't want me to own like a 1-bedroom house. Like I don't deserve to own the place that I live if I work hard and try to pay for it my whole life. Super disgusting and really sinister. We should definitely be going after that, I think. And that would be a great issue coalition too, because even people who are pretty far left progressive, they don't want the world's elites planning our lives. I know they're not about that.
Right. It
That's
seems like a perfect system for absolute control if you don't own anything. Right now, I mean, how many Americans are absolutely hostage to the ban on evictions and foreclosures? I mean, if that goes away, there's a lot of people that are at least saying that they're in the position that they're going to be homeless. I mean, that makes you hostage to the politicians that have that policy in place, especially when they're the ones also preventing you from earning an income. So if they're not going to let you go out and work a job, and then they're going to say, the only thing keeping you in your house months at a time, it keeps everybody nice and, in line with, oh, this politician is what's saving me from being homeless. And conditioning and fear and stuff is absolutely insane. So it's a really important point.
One of the worst things that happened during the lockdowns is that it shut down the opportunities a lot of us had to go out and talk about politics in person with our friends and our family members. So I could imagine, they shut down everything that was public, and they shut down everything that they owned. So if they could also shut down our homes because we don't own them, that's a really frightening thought. We need to be able to protect our spaces. I mean, we've seen how difficult it has been to engage in political discourse on traditional social media outlets. So I would like to at least protect the ability to do that in my own home.
Well, I have to grab onto this because this is the perfect opportunity to roll into our bonus question. So everybody agree on that, or is it time to do that? All right. So the bonus question is just vague, to pick on that, to pull that thread of censorship. When you have this kind of censorship, largely against activists, indie media, some politicians, and other voices, when you have this unregulated, arbitrary censorship that leads to deplatforming and other things, are we moving toward, is that like a modern day virtual gulag kind of thing where, they just kind of plucked people from what I'm not a great historian, right? So I'll just take a very simplistic explanation of what the gulags were in the Soviet era, but basically problematic people, dissenters, would be just kind of plucked out of their homes and thrown into gulags that were in different places all over that vast country. They were shut up. There were also labor camps, and they were able to just do that. The answer to the bonus question is in a bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to these. There's one for almost every interview by subscribing at Patreon. Plus, you get access to other patrons-only episodes, Q&A live streams and such, and the Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my tease, and I hope that some of you will join us. I'll continue now with the interview wrap-up. And I know we need to wrap up. So if anybody else, so I'm going to roll back now into the public part of the interview and ask everybody to sort of wrap up, and Angela, for you to tell us where to find your work and how to support you and how to keep in contact, read your stuff and all of that.
Thank you so much for having me on. For anyone who's interested in following my chair race for the Libertarian National Party in 2022, you can go to angelamcardle.com. If you're interested in getting some resources to grow a local anti-lockdown movement too, you can contact me there as well. I'm happy to share with you the information I have, how I set up mailing lists, CRM, all of those things so that you can help to keep track of your movement. If you're interested in joining the Libertarian Party in Los Angeles County, you can visit our website, lplac.us, and you can see what it's like to have principled activism happening in your local community.
Okay, well, I think that's it. It was great talking to everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Angela McArdle. Follow Angela on Twitter at Angela4 Congress, and on her website, angelamccardle.com. Follow Kyle Anzalone on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_ and at the con_interest account for his show. Subscribe to the Conflicts of Interest podcast at the Libertarian Institute and on YouTube and now Library. Also follow Kelley Lane on Twitter at Kelley's Words. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in at Patreon, patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, or paypal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find the podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, and if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also follow us on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.